Streaming from Abbey Cat Recording Studio in Chicago.
You are listening to Influenced, a podcast where we explore what makes great music influential. Welcome to the Doobie Brothers episode of the second season of Influenced. My name is Blake Sokoloff.
I'm Robert Dean, and we are doing the Doobies.
Probably one of the most quintessential 70s bands up there with like Leonard Skinner and some of those other bands.
Well, we could go down the list, right?
Oh, yeah,
but,
for
you know,
sure.
that Listen to the Music was their first hit.
Yeah, definitely.
Summer of 1972.
Yeah, that's a great song, and that's off their second album. So we want to get kind of into the history of the band a little bit. And just for fair warning, we're going to get into a lot of members over this podcast. I mean, the Doobie Brothers is kind of famous for having I think it's something like 12 or 13 official members kind of throughout their career. So there's going to be a lot of names going in and out of this episode.
Definitely. And only one member,
yeah,
Patrick Simmons, that was there the entire time.
Yeah, so one consistent member, and the band does definitely start out with a kind of duo partnership between Patrick Simmons and the other kind of original frontman of the band, Tom Johnston. Right. Their sort of musical genesis happened in kind of early 70s California, like a lot of musicians in that decade. A lot of them, like Pat Simmons, had kind of made his way to California as like kind of a hippie kid at the end of the 60s and kind of just wound up there as kind of a folk guitarist and folk singer. And he started hearing about this house that a bunch of musicians and hippies lived in, including Tom Johnston and John Hartman, who were kind of the other two original Doobie Brothers. And Tom Johnston and John Hartman had actually had like a kind of a very loud, very raucous kind of three-piece power pop band, very inspired by the Kinks, that they just called Pug. So we're going to play like one of their biggest influences right here, which was the Kinks. You Really Got Me, obviously one of the biggest hits by the Kinks, kind of a mid-60s classic, I would say. But here's You Really Got Me.
Girl, you really got me going. You got me so I don't know what I'm doing. You got me so I can't sleep at night. Yeah, you really got me now. You got me so I don't know what I'm doing. Oh yeah, you really got me now. You got me so I can't sleep at night. You really got me. You really got me. You really got me.
It's a good example of the great background lyrics and, sound that the Kinks had and the Doobies obviously picked up on.
That's definitely, I mean, that's kind of the one of the main things that really brought the Doobies to kind of musical attention generally, is when Patrick Simmons kind of got into that fold. Pat Simmons was also an incredible finger pick and folk style guitarist. Pat started jamming with Tom Johnston, who was a very kind of rock and roll, chugga 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 rhythm guitarist, very, very loud, very rock. That kind of combination of that kind of folk finger-picked, very precision-based guitar playing meshed really well with Tom Johnston's very rhythmic, propulsion-based rhythmic guitar. So they started jamming and playing shows, and they attracted kind of a really, really intense biker crowd. They made really good friends with a lot of the Hells Angels at the time. They were playing at a lot of biker bars and places like that in California. So these bikers would show up and they'd be the Doobies would be playing. They'd have these crazy loud dual guitars because both Tom Johnston and Patrick Simmons were very, very great guitarists and kind of had a really cool kind of dual lead guitar sound that would become a staple of their kind of the Tom Johnston Simmons era of the Doobie Brothers. And so I'm going to play here real quick a song. This was actually off of their third album. This is the song China Grove, which is kind of one of the best examples of that like raucous kind of guitar duo style that Pat Simmons and Tom Johnston really became known for. And at this point, the band had really kind of expanded their sound to kind of get what they wanted in the studio. Like the band was kind of notably not super happy with the way their first album turned out, so they actually shuffled around a couple band members, brought in kind of the guy who would become the bass player for most of the band's career, Tieran Porter, who's an incredible bass player and a great backing vocalist as well. And they also decided to kind of expand their rhythmic power by adding a second drummer, which became a major trademark of the Doobie Brothers sound and their just look on stage, which was a crazy stage setup with two drummers and everything. So that was really big kind of part of the Doobies expansion. But here's China Grove, which is the kind of culmination or one of the culminations of kind of the hard rock early Doobie Brothers sound. And this was off of their third album,
The Captain and Me.
When the sun comes up on a sleepy little town down around San Antonio, and the folks are rising for another day round about their home, the people of the town are strange and they're proud of where they came. Where you talking about the time I go? China Grove. Well, the preacher and the teacher, no, they're across. They are the talk.
There's your quintessential Doobie Brothers song, little song about Texas.
Definitely. I mean, it's a great song about Texas from a California rock band.
Exactly.
Like,
What did
I
they know
mean-
about Texas? They
I
knew
mean-
something about it.
I mean, there's a lot of that. I mean, the Eagles are writing a ton of fake Southern hits from their beach houses in California. So that's definitely another kind of trademark of, I think, 70s rock is just like
Writing about Texas, writing about the South.
Yeah.
You know, like Blackwater.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a very good segue into kind of one of the honestly one of the reasons the Doobie Brothers became such a enduring band, because the Doobie Brothers have kind of always been a band that's like teetered around, especially because of how many people just come and go from that band. Like there's a lot of kind of stresses, and they also throughout the whole 70s they were almost entirely constantly on the road. Like that band toured nonstop, which also kind of puts a lot of stress on band members. So I've read a lot of interviews that they were kind of coming off of a tour they weren't super happy with, and like their second and third albums had kind of been they were a lot happier with the way those albums had been made and recorded and written, but they still weren't quite selling the way they really wanted to. But then they got off this tour and were kind of just told by their manager, who kind of frantically called them one day and was like, "Hey, just so you know, next week you guys are going to have a number one hit with Black Water," which was written by Pat Simmons and was actually like a B-side to a single they had released earlier that year. And all of a sudden, Black Water got kind of placed in a couple just radio station playlists around the Midwest, and that just snowballed into just becoming a global hit. And it's got a great chorus that's a lot of fun to sing along to. And it's kind of one of the quintessential, I would say, like campfire songs.
Yeah.
It's a classic. And it really showcases Pat Simmons' kind of folk guitar playing, and like one of the biggest kind of things that he brought to the Doobie Brothers, other than being like kind of their consistent member and like the soul of the band, really. So here's Black Water, which was the first Doobie Brothers number one hit in, I think, 1973.
74, actually.
74 was when it hit number one.
Yep.
Oh, black water, keep on rolling. Mississippi moon, won't you keep on shining on? Oh, black water, keep on rolling. Mississippi moon, won't you keep on shining on? Oh, black water, keep on rolling. Mississippi moon, won't you keep on shining on me? Yeah, keep on shining your light. Gonna make everything great. Mama gonna make everything alright.
right. Well, we're in Chicago, but I feel right now I'm in the southern United States, just watching the lazy river
Oh, definitely.
flow on by.
It's definitely, I mean, that's a great Bayou track for sure. That song specifically really kind of catapulted the Doobies to a whole nother kind of realm of touring and shows and just, I mean, they were already on the road almost 24/7, but now they were on the road like 24/7, including Christmas.
Yeah. And, and one kind of unique thing about that song that I think hooked a lot of people is if you're not really that familiar, our listeners may not be totally familiar with that song. It's from, 1974. It's a little old. Later in that song, if you happen to have a stereo with two speakers, so you have separation like we do here in the studio, Abbey Cat. Later on in the song, there's just like a ton of separation going on. And I think people riding around in their cars and they had listening to it on FM radio, heard that separation and just sort of went nuts over it.
Oh, definitely. I mean, like that actually goes back to a point on China Grove too. Like that's definitely something the Doobie Brothers played with a lot. Like if you listen to China Grove, like it's actually in the entire right speaker is Tom Johnston's guitar,
Right.
and then the entire left speaker is Pat Simmons' guitar, which kind of creates a very cool mishmash of sound going back and forth between the different kind of rhythmic styles and the different kind of intensities that they're each playing. And that also kind of goes to show like the Doobie Brothers were definitely getting more and more interested in like the ways that music production was kind of opening up and expanding in the mid to late 70s, especially with their like kind of third to like fourth albums when they were really kind of exploring a lot of that kind of stuff. They got more comfortable recording in the studio and were actually like, hey, what if we kind of played with some things that made these songs sound way more exciting? So that kind of stuff definitely kind of shows you that the Doobies were definitely expanding their musical kind of taste, even if like their music tastes might seem to some at this point, especially like sort of just simplistic rock and blues influences with some southern rock and country in there. But by 74, 75, they really started expanding their sound, which also kind of came from maybe nabbing a few members from Steely Dan, starting with their guitarist, Jeff Baxter, who joined the Doobie Brothers in 1974 as what they wanted to be kind of their third guitarist, because both Pat and Tom were singing a lot of songs, and they wanted someone who could kind of be playing a lot of the leads and things like that just constantly throughout their shows. So they brought in Jeff Baxter, who goes by Skunk Baxter, who made a pretty big name for himself in Steely Dan. Like he plays on a lot of their pretty much all their albums through Pretzel Logic, but he's one of the things he's most known for in Steely Dan is playing the guitar solo, the kind of lead guitar, and obviously the solo for one of Steely Dan's biggest hits, actually, Ricky Don't Lose My Number, one of the singles off of their 73, I believe, album, 74, excuse me, album Pretzel Logic. And so here's Ricky Don't Lose My Number, kind of the lead guitar solo section played by Jeff Baxter. So here you go, Ricky Don't Lose My Number by Steely Dan.
When you get home,
Skunk Baxter was a great pickup by the Doobie Brothers.
Definitely. And I mean, that kind of his very flashy, very in-your-face lead guitar was definitely something that the Doobies started executing in their songs as well. And Skunk was also just a very accomplished kind of multi-instrumentalist as well. Like he actually had made some appearances before becoming an official member, playing some slide guitar and things like that on albums like Captain and What Once Were Vices Are Now Habits. Probably the biggest steal I would say the Doobie Brothers made from Steely Dan was when they nabbed the keyboardist and vocalist Michael McDonald, who joined the band kind of as Tom Johnston had been having some personal issues and health issues. Like he had some issues with ulcers kind of his whole life, like since he was a kid in high school, but the kind of long time constant touring and just eating fast food and probably doing a little bit of cocaine didn't play well with Tom Johnston's health. So he kind of needed to kind of 3 or 4 days into what was at that point their biggest tour ever, he had to drop out, and because he was just throwing up, and he started throwing up blood, and some pretty serious medical issues,
major health problems.
Yeah, so they kind of were left at the beginning of a tour without a lead singer, and Jeff Baxter, who they just obviously picked up from Steely Dan, was like, "Hey, there's this guy I played with in Steely Dan. I think he's kind of just doing his own thing, like playing some bars and playing kind of just as a singer songwriter here. I could call him up and say like, hey, you're in the Doobie Brothers now, if you want me to. And the band was like, yeah, bring him over. We need somebody. So
I think it was like one of these situations, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like the Doobie Brothers are thinking, can we really get Michael McDonald? And Michael McDonald's like, could I really be a Doobie Brother?
Exactly. I mean, the Doobie Brothers at that point, like Peg had been recorded, which I'll play just a second, which was kind of the song that brought Michael McDonald to a lot of people's attention because the backing vocals, which he is the only sole backing vocalist on that song, Peg. So there's like 3 or 4 layers of Michael McDonald in those backing vocals. And it's fairly iconic. So here's Peg off of the Steely Dan album Asia, which is definitely, I would say, what ended up being Michael McDonald's audition into the band.
Yeah.
But here's Peg. So there's a story that Tieran Porter has told a few times in some interviews that talks about like when Michael McDonald got off the plane to start rehearsing with the Doobies, and he sits down at his Rhodes piano that they had set up for him. They're like, all right, can we just hear you sing something or whatever? So he goes right into a version of, I think it was actually a version of China Grove that he had been kind of playing as just like a singer-songwriter, like he had been playing a couple Doobie songs in his set. So he launches into a version of China Grove, and immediately like Tieran and all the other guys were like, that's the voice. Like, that's the voice we want. Like, you can hear in that, in Peg, like that, he's got such a depth and such a clarity to his voice. That's definitely it's a very rare voice, I would say for sure. He was also very aware that his musical approach had been very different to what the Doobies had been doing kind of prior. And he was kind of like, oh, I hope they don't hate me as I come in and kind of change this Southern rock band into kind of more of an R&B, more Motown influenced band. Like Michael McDonald was very influenced by a lot of bands like the Spinners and the Temptations, which I'll play a track from the Spinners here real quick. Here's It's a Shame, which was a very famous single by the Spinners and kind of illustrates that very clear Motown sound that Michael McDonald was very influenced by.
It's a shame the way you mess around with your man. It's a shame the way you hurt me. It's a shame the way you mess around with your man. I'm sitting all alone by the telephone, waiting for your call. When you don't call at all, it's a shame the way you mess around with your man. It's a shame the way you play with my emotions. It's a shame the way you mess
Yeah, I mean, as the Doobies headed into the next album, Taking It to the Streets, you can hear it. You can just hear that influence on
definitely
on that album.
Definitely. And I mean, it's and I've also heard from interviews with some of the members of the Doobies at the time, like this was it was a pretty major change for them. Obviously it was a major change for Michael and the rest of the Doobies themselves. Like the music that they started writing with Michael on board was a lot more orchestrated and a lot more like there were horns appearing on some songs. They were maybe bringing in string players, a lot more background singers, other keyboardists and musicians and things. So where before they had been very much like a loud rock band that's doing a lot of like jamming and extended guitar solos and things like that. And if you got to make room for horns and pianos and things like that in your music, you're not necessarily going to be as freeform in the studio. So that took some getting used to for a few members of the band. And actually shortly after Michael McDonald joined the band, Michael Hosack, who had been the original second drummer of the band, kind of just decided he had had enough. Like he had enough of the band changes and of just like the new sound. And I don't know if he really felt like he had a place in the Doobies with kind of their new kind of sound and then what they were heading for. And Tom Johnston was kind of also found himself in a strange place, having sort of recovered from some of his health issues to the point where he was able to at least join the band in the studio again. Now that Michael was around, there were now like 3, sometimes even 4, because Tieran would sing some songs as well. There were 4 kind of singers in the band, and 3 or 4 people who were kind of vying for that frontman role. So they do kind of talk about how the recording of the Take It to the Streets album was a little bit of like some of the guys kind of dancing around each other in the studio just because they don't want to step on each other's toes. And Michael was very aware he was the new guy, but also very aware that he wanted to be a successful musician and put his best foot forward. So here's Take It to the Streets, which kind of was the first single that really illustrated the kind of new chapter that the Doobie Brothers were kind of heading on with Michael McDonald in the driver's seat now for the most part. So here's Take It to the Streets off of their album Taking It to the Streets.
You don't know me, but I'm your brother. I was raised here in this living hell. You don't know my kind in your world. Fairly soon the time will tell. You telling me the things you're gonna do for me. I ain't blind and I don't like what I think I see. Taking it to the street. Taking it to the street. Taking it to the street. No more need for running.
Yeah, still the Doobies with the great background vocals, but what a different sound. And the other big hit on that album was It Keeps You Running, with also a major feature for Michael McDonald.
Definitely. I mean, like he kind of wrote the 2 biggest hits on that album. And actually, like, if you look at their discography, the next 3 albums, which are obviously starting with Taking It to the Streets and then Living on a Fault Line and then Minute by Minute, are all named after Michael McDonald written songs. So that definitely goes to show you how big his presence became in the band kind of almost overnight.
And how quickly,
Exactly.
Right.
And like that definitely, like once they started kind of playing shows and going on the tour for Taking It to the Streets, like Tom Johnston sort of started feeling like, I even know if I really belong in this musical environment. Like, I just don't know if there's much for me to do. And like Michael's kind of the new lead singer, so I'm not really the lead singer anymore. So after the tour of Taking It to the Streets, Tom Johnston did decide to hang it up from the Doobie Brothers for the longest time that he ended up hanging up from the Doobie Brothers. Like it was a good 5 or 6 year break that he decided to take after that album. And for that time, he kind of considered it leaving the band officially. Like he wasn't considering it necessarily a break per se. He was kind of looking at it as, I'm leaving the band. That also definitely set the stage for what would become the kind of next few years of the Doobie Brothers kind of career And like I'll play the title track off Living on a Fault Line here real quick. Kind of the next big hit for the band, which again was a very, very, very Michael McDonald led song and kind of album. I mean, like the album, the song itself, Living on a Fault Line, is a co-write between Pat Simmons and Michael McDonald. And Pat does have some vocals in the first verse, but Michael sings the rest of the song and sings some great harmony vocals. So it definitely goes to show you how much Michael was kind of putting into the band. And take Living on the Fault Line also has the most Michael McDonald lead vocals of any Doobie Brothers album. I believe of the 10 songs, he sings lead on 7 and like kind of co-lead on another song. So there's only 2 songs on that album that Michael McDonald does not sing lead on. So here's Living on a Fault Line off of the 1977 album, Living on a Fault Line.
Yeah, that good album. It was kind of one of the few Doobie Brothers albums that didn't actually have a top 40 hit on it, but it was I think music people like that album.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's definitely one of my personal favorite Doobie Brothers albums
just
for
really,
sure.
really holds together well. And they did a Marvin Gaye song on there, Little Darling.
Yeah, that's very true. And I mean, that definitely goes to show exactly how intense the R&B influence had become, like where they were literally covering songs by some of the best R&B artists of all time.
Right.
So, and that album also, Living on a Fault Line, like Pat Simmons has said, the reason the band really liked that kind of song title and concept for an album is because being in the Doobie Brothers sort of almost felt like living on a fault line, because they were kind of a chameleon of musical styles, and just like so many people went in and out of that band. So you were always kind of living on a fault line of like, oh, we're on tour and then we're recording and then on tour again with a new drummer and a new guitarist and something like that. So there was a lot of change, and they almost kind of, the core guys in that band definitely sort of felt like they were living on a fault line, to so to speak. And kind of, I would say, as a result of that album not necessarily having any hits as big as the hits on Taking It to the Street, Michael definitely started feeling a lot of the kind of pressure of like, I've got to deliver, and I don't want to get fired from this band that has all this go through of guys. So Michael was like, I like being a Doobie Brother. I like being a professional musician. So I really have to, whatever our next album is, I have to make sure it's like the most I can put into anything as a musician. So the next album, which is their 1978 album, Minute by Minute, was kind of the most involved Michael had ever been in the studio and kind of directing the other Doobies. Tieran Porter has said in interviews that they probably did What a Fool Believes, one of the singles on that album, written by Michael. They probably did 50 takes of that song.
I believe it.
Just because Michael was such a perfectionist about what he wanted. That album also continues Michael's dominance as the main creative force of the band. It also kind of marks a level of control that Michael hadn't necessarily had on songs before, like to really just make the songs how he was conceiving them in his head, which actually started to become a big issue specifically between Michael and Skunk Baxter. Potentially because they had known each other both prior to joining the Doobie Brothers, so maybe Jeff felt like he had more of a right to criticize Michael than some of the other guys in the band, and maybe vice versa as well. But it actually goes to show that, like, for a band with 3 guitarists, like the song Minute by Minute actually does not, the recording of the song does not actually feature any guitar from any of the guitarists in that band. And from for a band which features like generally like 3 prominent guitarists, like that's it, to have 0 guitar on one of their bigger recordings was definitely a departure for the band. And so I'll play Minute by Minute here real quick, which is kind of a very quintessential Michael McDonald led track with just kind of him and Tieran Porter's vocals being the main kind of draw of the song. So here's Minute by Minute by the Doobie Brothers off of their album Minute by Minute from 1978.
Hey, don't worry, I've been lied to. I've been here many times before. Girl, don't you worry, I know where I stand. I don't need this love, I don't need your hand. I know I could turn, blink and you'd be gone. That I must be prepared anytime to carry on. But minute by minute by minute by minute, I keep holding on. I'll be holding on. I'll be holding minute by minute by minute by minute. I keep holding on. Oh, baby, you would stay just to watch me die.
Yeah, so maybe that was a song that did it, you know, in terms of the bitterness between Skunk and Michael. I mean, hey, Skunk, go hang your guitar on the wall for a few days. We're not going to listen to it.
Yeah. So after kind of Minute by Minute, before the band decided to go on tour for that album, Skunk announced that he was leaving the band. And also, I think prior to the recording of Minute by Minute, kind of because of all the kind of changeover after Tom Johnston had kind of officially left, John Hartman, who had kind of also been the original first drummer of the band, left as well, which led them to bring in Keith Knutson, who kind of became their main drummer and kind of one of the main vocalists, backing vocalists at least for the later albums, Minute by Minute, and their last album, One Step Closer. So that kind of change around definitely put the Doobies in a weird place. And so they were going on tour for Minute by Minute. And the last tour that Skunk Baxter went on was about a 1.5 to 2 week tour of Japan that the Doobies went on for during the Minute by Minute tour. And just, I think Michael and Jeff really were kind of coming to a head at that album or on that tour. And it seems like from what I can gather, like it really came down to the fact that Jeff started just like, which I can understand having been in the band for probably 5 or 6 years at that point. He started just like noodling around and being like, just not playing what his parts were live. He would just start playing kind of whatever he felt like playing, which really just got into Michael's gears when Michael was just like, hey, play straight or play what we wanted you to play. Just play the blues part you're playing for this song instead of just like shredding like you're playing some like acid rock or something like that. So that kind of relationship deteriorated and Skunk left the band in the middle of the Minute by Minute tour, which sort of put the band in weird spirits, sort of until they got back from that Japanese tour. And like they actually, I guess, for a few hours broke up on the plane back from Japan. Like Pat Simmons and Michael got together and they were like, you know, I think we got to call it after this tour. And then they get off the plane and their manager is like, hey, What a Fool Believes has gone to #1 and you guys are eligible for like 6 or 7 Grammys that year. So they got back together. They had a meeting and they were like, well, maybe we should keep this thing going. So I'm going to play What a Fool Believes here real quick, which is, again, a Michael McDonald song that he wrote actually with Kenny Loggins. But here's What a Fool Believes, the Doobie Brothers' second #1 hit, and also the song they won a Grammy for Record of the Year for. So here's What a Fool Believes.
Never coming near what you wanted to say. surely know who's watching her go. But what a fool believes he sees. The wise man has the power.
So, What a Fool Believes was the band's Doobie Brothers from the whole history of the Doobie Brothers, the number one hit for that band.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's definitely their highest selling single.
Definitely.
And like obviously it's the song they won a Grammy for. I do believe they won a couple Grammys for Minute by Minute as an album as a whole as well. But there's actually footage you can find on YouTube or wherever, but it kind of illustrates the fraction in the band at the time, because when the Doobies all got called up for Record of the Year, like, hey, the winner of Record for the Year is Doobie Brothers for What a Fool Believes. Skunk was there at the ceremony because he was on the Minute by Minute album, but he is the only guy who's sitting in that area that doesn't go up on stage. Like, he didn't want to go up on stage.
Really?
Even though he's on the album and on What a Fool Believes, the song, he just didn't feel like he should go up on stage and wanted to kind of just sit back and stay in the audience. So you can kind of see footage of that happening in real time, where the rest of the band gets up to go accept the Grammy and give their speeches, where Jeff Baxter just kind of hangs back and he's just like, I'm just gonna chill or whatever. So that was kind of the end of his kind of relationship with the band and the Doobie Brothers, other than like some short reunions in the later 80s and early 90s. But after the Minute by Minute album, they again kind of just got on the road for what felt like another probably year or two. And they also, because they had some people leave the band kind of after Minute by Minute, they ended up bringing in a few more Doobie Brothers for the next kind of record, and then their last batch of touring, which was Cornelius Bumpus, who as a saxophone and keyboard player, and John McPhee, not John McVie from Fleetwood Mac,
right.
John McPhee, who had just been like an LA guitarist who had played in a few bands at that point, but they brought him as kind of a lead guitar replacement for Skunk, which kind of solidified like what was kind of the last major incarnation of the Doobie Brothers, with Cornelius and John McPhee in the band. And that is what kind of led to the band's kind of last album in their sort of original run. Like they've had some albums as after they've reunited and things like that, but it led to their album One Step Closer, which was released in 1980, and it's the only official album to feature Cornelius Bumpus as an official Doobie, and for a long number of years was the only official album to feature John McPhee as well. But I'm gonna play One Step Closer, the title track of that album, just kind of illustrate where the Doobies were sonically at that point, because they really were like going fully into that kind of R&B sound with Michael, and especially with Cornelius Bumpus as well, being a saxophone player. I mean, that's the only official time they had a horn player as an official member of the Doobie Brothers. So that definitely shows you kind of where they were at with the band at that point. So here's One Step Closer off the album of the same name from 1980.
Yeah, and the Michael McDonald version of the Doobie Brothers, especially that later stuff, the 78 and 1980 albums, you can kind of hear some of the influence that they had on some bands, like definitely Dave Matthews, Blues Traveler,
definitely.
their friend Kenny Loggins. I mean, it just impacted a bunch of bands and performers that were kind of coming out in the 80s.
Oh, definitely. And I'll play a Carly Simon track, which is actually one of her biggest hits, but it's a song she co-wrote in the kind of mid 70s with Michael McDonald. But there's actually is a version of the song as a Doobie Brothers track. On living on a fault line. But You Belong to Me ended up being one of Carly Simon's biggest kind of hits in that time frame, which kind of just illustrated how many people Michael McDonald was collaborating with and how in demand he was as a songwriter. And he was writing with everyone, like Bob just mentioned, Kenny Loggins and like Carly Simon, and he was even collaborating with artists as diverse as, like, I'm pretty sure there's a Van Halen track with a Michael McDonald co-write, just because he was so in demand at that time. But here's You Belong to Me by Carly Simon, one of her biggest hits from her 1978 album Boys in the Trees.
Yeah, big hit for Carly Simon all over the radio. But I would recommend to our listeners to maybe go back to back with the Carly Simon version and the Doobie Brothers version and listen to them back to back.
Definitely. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, like, there's a lot of really great just differences between the two, but you can really hear the soul comes through in both versions, and both versions are great. And I do just want to real quick, because it is kind of just like a crazy musical collaboration. I'll play real quick here the song I'll Wait, which was the Van Halen Michael McDonald collaboration from the album that Van Halen released in 1984, which was actually produced by Ted Templeman, who was kind of the regular producer for the Doobie Brothers. So that's likely how that collaboration wound up happening. But still, it's just so interesting to see that Michael McDonald and the Doobies sound in general was just so in demand that artists as wide varying as Carly Simon and Van Halen were trying to get in on the action, so to speak. So here's I'll Wait.
You got me captured, I'm under your spell. I guess I'll never learn. I am your picture, yes, I know it well. Another page is turned. Are you for real? It's so hard to tell from just a magazine. Yeah, you just smiled and the picture sells. Look what that does to me. I'll wait till your love goes down. I'm coming straight for your heart.
Yeah, I don't think Michael McDonald was going to be able to get the guitar out of Eddie Van Halen's hands, but
Yeah, true.
but you can totally hear the influence there on
Definitely,
Van Halen.
especially with those like keyboards, and those keyboard chord changes are very, very Michael McDonald. Just the rhythm and the style there, and like one of the other kind of, I guess, more surprising ways in which the Doobie Brothers have kind of influenced music is their music has actually ended up being sampled by a number of both hip hop and electronic artists. Like songs featuring Drake have actually used samples from Minute by Minute. The song that Michael wrote with Carly Simon, the Doobie Brothers version, You Belong to Me, was actually sampled by Jay Dilla in 2016. So there's a lot of kind of hip hop and electronics influences, or that's just not necessarily where you would expect the Doobie Brothers to pop up on a sample from a Drake song or something like that. But I'm also going to play a song by the Avalanches, another kind of favorite electronic artist of mine, who actually sampled Black Water on a number of songs, but here is Subways by the Avalanches, which samples Black Water. It's always kind of interesting to hear where the kind of Doobie Brothers music will pop up. And it's just very interesting to see them, like samples of Black Water popping up in a song from 2016 from like an electronic artist. So here's Subways by the Avalanches, which samples Black Water by from the 1973 Doobie Brothers album.
Yeah, it's very cool.
So it's very just, I mean, that's obviously not anywhere near where you would think a Doobie Brothers song or album would pop up as a sample. And while it's not the whole band, I wanted to talk about a recent collaboration between Michael McDonald and actually one of the most notable hip-hop instrumentalists and players kind of in the modern musical industry, Thundercat, who in his 2017 album Drunk collaborated with Michael McDonald and actually Kenny Loggins as well, Michael's friend and the co-writer of What a Fool Believes. But the song called Show You the Way is a collaboration between Thundercat and Michael McDonald and Kenny Loggins. And it's very interesting to hear Michael show up on a very recent album, and this album only came out in 2017, singing in a very different genre than he normally typically would. Like, this is very much like a very modern R&B and hip hop song. So here's Thundercat with Michael McDonald and Kenny Loggins.
Might not be true. Long as love lies within them. Just hold your face into the light. Though right now you might not know why. Long as love lies within. There ain't no wrong way, baby. Let me show you the way.
Yeah, it just definitely goes to show the kind of, I mean, how many people just love their music, and their music is definitely, I would say, fairly timeless in its age and the way it's kind of permeated society. And it's actually pretty telling that, no, I mean, the Doobie Brothers have been in an on and off kind of touring band for the last like few years, but actually, honestly, the last couple decades,
Right.
kind of since the 90s, they've kind of gotten back together a number of times for various reunions and things. But Michael McDonald actually kind of rejoined the Doobies for the first time, I think, really since the One Step Closer album, for an actual tour. And I don't know if they've recorded anything with Michael yet new or anything, but he's kind of an official Doobie Brother again for the first time since 1980, which is pretty interesting. So I wanted to kind of leave the podcast with the kind of the last top 10 hit the Doobie Brothers ever had, which is off One Step Closer, but it's the song Real Love, written and sung by Michael McDonald. Kind of they're the I would say the band leader, or at least the front man for the last half of the band's kind of recorded career. I would say Pat Simmons is sort of the leader of the Doobie Brothers, in that, like,
I agree.
When the Doobie Brothers did sort of officially break up for 5 or 6 years, it was actually because Pat Simmons started just realizing that there were more guys in the Doobie Brothers that were just going to work than were playing the songs for the love of playing the songs.
Yeah.
And that just kind of, like, as Pat was kind of the sole original member at that point. I think that at that point he kind of just felt a little too alone and maybe a little not necessarily the greatest about getting in the studio with a bunch of guys who were looking at it as like their next paycheck or whatever. So he did kind of retire the Doobie Brothers for 5 or 6 years to kind of take a break and kind of rejuvenate himself and everything like that. But the Doobie Brothers are definitely one of my favorite bands from the 70s, and I think definitely one of the most influential bands, especially with the way that like the Michael McDonald era Doobie Brothers kind of shaped a lot of the kind of 80s and 90s kind of R&B and rock sound and soul sound as well. So I wanted to kind of leave off with Real Love from One Step Closer. And this has been the Doobie Brothers episode of the second season of Influence. So thank you guys so much for listening.
Thanks for listening. We appreciate it.
Definitely. So here's Real Love. Have a great one.